able to catch up a little bit here. All right, so we got our first invasive here. Shrub with lots of little berries. These simple leaves that are opposite from each other. So this plant has what we call opposite branching, where the branches come out directly across from one another, as opposed to alternate, where they kind of alternate up the stem. And this is what is known as privet, or specifically Chinese privet. And it was introduced, I'm not sure exactly when, but I know it was introduced decades ago as a hedgerow plant, popular landscaping plant, just because it grows real thick and produces lots of these little kind of attractive berries that birds do appreciate. But like many invasives, it's kind of gotten a little out of control since then and can really take over an area. It's not too bad in here, but I've seen it, really form pretty dense monocultures in other areas. So this is privet. Too far, actually. Got another one right here. A very particular looking plant. You can see another opposite branching plant with the stems and the leaves growing opposite one another. It's got these little projections along the branching that we call wings, and that gives it one of its common names, which is winged euonymus. Winged euonymus. It's also called burning bush, because in the fall it has this brilliant red foliage, which is very, very pretty, and this very interesting kind of bark pattern with the wings is also very attractive, which is what brought it here in the first place. It's another invasive from I believe Asia, and it was brought here as, like many invasives, as an ornamental plant, and you could still see it across Massachusetts, different places in the Northeast, like planted in gardening beds and things like that. And there are some native euonymus. So euonymus is the genus, and winged euonymus is the specific species here. So there's many species within the genus euonymus, and we do have one native euonymus to the States, but it's isolated to a very small part, I believe in the Midwest somewhere. So any euonymus that you see, any burning bush that you see out in the woods, is almost certainly the invasive winged euonymus here. And this again can grow very dense thick stands. They also have these kind of particular looking elongated little berries here. So that's another aspect of it. I do believe I think they turn red eventually. I'm not super certain on that, but yeah. This is winged euonymus, or burning bush. Yeah. So you'll see quite a bit of this in this first part of the walk here. Yeah.
I have a question for you.
Yes. Yeah. Sure.
With all the rain we have, how is that going to impact the foliage?
Plant.
Sometimes they'll say it's going to be good because of this.
Yeah.
I interrupted you, sorry.
No, it's fine. It's things. I tend to think things growing a little bit more lush when we have those really heavy years of rain. Especially, like, a lot of plants seem to, or anecdotally from what I've seen, they seem to put out a lot more fruits.
Yeah.
So like 2 years ago, we had that super wet summer, and you'd be driving by like spruce trees, pine trees, whatever, they'd just be like hanging down with all the cones that they have.
That's one of our apple trees.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of plants get real heavy with their fruits. Yeah. But yeah, it can be various things depending on exactly the micro environment that you're in. It could be flooded out, or it all kind of depends. So this whole area actually is an interesting history. It used to be, there is a breached dam on the Nashua that broke back in the 1930s. But prior to that, the dam was used to produce hydroelectric power for a rail train, like a railway that came up from Worcester, I believe. It's called the Worcester Railway Dam. And there used to actually be like an amusement park type of thing down here, like back 100 years ago while the dam was still functioning. And this is an associated structure with that. I'm not totally sure what it was, but there's a little pool of water that kind of forms up here that's surrounded by these sort of levee-like things. But a lot of this is built up from the dam. The pool of water, the lake that would be held up behind the dam would come up almost to this level on the other side of the hill. So
this whole area is
yeah, very impressive. The dam broke in 1937, and all the land lower down on there was under the lake. So, yeah. All right. So,
'Cause I have some of that in my yard and it looks nasty.
yeah, it is pretty nasty. So, we're talking about this plant here. You can see it's got these interesting little leaves that bow out near the end. It's got these elongated, not quite as elongated as the euonymus berries, but these kind of elongated berries that are green and turn red after a little while. They should be turning red in the next month or so. And before they're berries, they have they're little yellow hanging flowers that kind of dangle down in a similar way. And it could be easy to miss at first, but they are absolutely covered in these nasty little prickers here, these little thorns that will just slide right through your pant leg as you're walking by. But this is known as Japanese barberry.
Oh, just gonna guess barberry.
Yes.
Leaf shape.
Exactly, yeah. So they have, a very particular leaf shape, as we said here, that starts very skinny and then bows out, sort of like a little spoon shape there. And this is another shrub that, in the fall, it has a very pretty kind of red color to the foliage, and the red berries can be ornamental and very pretty as well. And that is why this was originally brought over. It's another ornamental plant that has escaped because these little red berries are very
Tasty to the birds.
very tasty for the birds. Exactly. I couldn't think of the word tasty, right? So they are very liked by the birds here, and birds will eat them and just spread them around. So if you think, oh, this is an ornamental shrub, like how did it get out here in the middle of the woods? It's because the birds are eating them and spreading them
How do I
around.
get rid of them?
You'd have to just dig it out, as far as I know. I don't know. It's not super aggressive. It's not a super aggressive resprouter like some things like Japanese knotweed and like tree of heaven, which is another plant that we'll see. But mechanical removal is probably the easiest and the best. Yeah, so this is some of that honeysuckle that you were talking about. There's a few species of honeysuckle, and again, we do have our native honeysuckles that are native to the east coast of the US and southeast Canada. But a lot of the honeysuckle that you see like getting out of control is this Asian variety. And it's very similar to the privet that we were talking about, but it has a little bit larger leaves. It's also opposite branching, but you can see some privet right here to compare. The leaves are a little bit more variable on the privet, and a little skinnier and smaller than they are on the honeysuckle here.
Does that produce a nice bloom at all that's kind of pretty? Or?
Honeysuckle, yeah, they do produce these little like paired flowers. They're kind of like little tubular flowers that do produce a fair bit of nectar, as far as I know. But
they smell, and they're supposed to smell.
yes,
Yeah. That's why people wanted them.
yeah,
It smells nice.
yes. And I'm not saying that's a quick, aggressive grower, so fill in an area really quick. I'm not as familiar with honeysuckle and its origins, but I believe it's probably another Eurasian species that's native to Europe and Asia, like a lot of our invasives. Anyone remember? A little knowledge check here. Winged, exactly.
Euonymus?
Winged euonymus. Very good, very
that
good.
Bark is interesting.
Yes,
It is.
winged euonymus.
It almost looks like a thorn, crown of thorns, or plant that has that jagged, papery coming off the bark.
Are those little berries?
Yeah, and these are the little berries here.
Oh look, there's like a little flower over there.
Oh, yeah.
Also called burning bush. So it might be a little easier to remember than euonymus, right?
Why is it called burning bush?
Your mom
It gets
has
this
some
really
of those
deep
that
red
you
color
pick out.
in the fall, which is a big. It's both the bark and the fall foliage are
Oh, the fudge.
the reasons for the. No, not the. I'm just saying the shape of the bark, that
Oh, okay.
interesting texture,
Yeah.
along with the color of the fall foliage are reasons that it's spread as popular ornamental.
Another one that we probably won't see, but is problematic, is Bradford pear.
Yes, no, we won't see any of that, but that is very problematic.
And if you, conservationists, do they want to get rid of these invasive plants or just live with it?
So a lot of invasives, they're called invasives because they move into an area and they can really take over, right? So they can be very difficult to get rid of a lot of the time.
That's actually interesting. Look at that like little like the grass that's growing there.
Yeah. So many invasives are very difficult to get rid of, and they spread very quickly. So unfortunately, the view that I tend to take is that species like this are a part of the landscape now here in North America, and every species that we see in our environment either evolved here or came in and incorporated itself into the ecology from elsewhere. So eventually something like that will happen with these invasives. It will take a long time for that balance to kind of work itself out. But species move into new areas all the time. It's the thing with this sort of very human influenced age that we live in, where that moving around is just happening way more often. So, there's a lot of big splashes in all these environments all across the world because all these new species are being introduced and they haven't co-evolved with the other species. So things like, especially invasive plants, can take over an area, and that's bad because, for two reasons, for a number of reasons. It takes over an environment and will crowd out native species that would otherwise grow there. So you're taking away native environments. They can also be reservoirs for diseases that can affect our native plants as well. That's how a number of invasive fungi and different plant pathogens have come about, is because of accidental introductions from like agricultural plants or ornamental plants that have been brought in. Yeah, chestnuts, exactly. So there was the chestnut blight from the early 1900s that came through and decimated American chestnut. That was the blight is caused by a fungus that's native to China. China has its own species of chestnut that co-evolve with the fungus and have better defenses for that type of thing. So there's a lot of reasons why invasives aren't very good for where they are. But yeah, we tend to put, a lot of judgment on that, but they're just, like any other species, they're out here trying to get by and survive. They just are in areas that they shouldn't necessarily be, right?
How common is it for a plant from another country to be favorable rather than invasive?
Not very often. So it's either, I guess there's three sort of things. Like a species could come in and it's just totally not suited to its new environment. It might not do very well. Certain species might come in and be, sort of well behaved, I guess, where, you see them in gardens a lot, but they don't tend to spread. There's certain species that we call them introduced rather than invasive because they might be non-native, but not necessarily problematic to the environment. And then many species tend to be invasive, and they'll, take over an area. Like I said, they haven't co-evolved with the other species, so there's no natural predators or natural pathogens in the environment to kind of keep those numbers down. And that's why they tend to outcompete native species, because they're all already dealing with all the challenges that they grew up with here.
I only ever hear invasive species attributed to plants. Is it a thing that happens with animals?
Yes, yeah, definitely.
Rabbits in in Australia.
Yes, yeah, lots of any kind of species that has evolved in a particular area has the potential to be introduced somewhere else and potentially be problematic. So
The Australian army once declared war on rabbits.
yes, yeah. So like rabbits are non-native to Australia. That's been a big problem.
Declared war.
There's species of deer on like different islands, different areas. Like in Hawaii, there's a species of deer that I know is, running rampant on one of the islands out there.
Also pigs.
Yeah,
like,
pigs are-
wild boars. Like they were actually introduced by the Polynesians.
Yep, pigs are a big invasive species in a lot of areas, and insects are a very big problem. We'll talk a little bit more about insects because it'll be relevant to another species later on. But yeah, any species, fungus, plant, animal, bacteria,
Bird.
bird.
Starling.
Yep, bird,
Now,
a lot of things. Yes.
Hate those.
they
Hate
ever
those guys.
thought of
They're the
taking
worst.
an invasive species like this
Mhm.
and seeing what the natural predator is in that country?
That,
and-
that just causes more
Yeah.
problems.
So that's called
Ancestors, yeah.
called biocontrol.
Yes, okay.
And there is some instances where that works, but it's always tricky
Yeah.
adding something new because that was the issue in the first place is you can't foresee all the interactions in the environment that could potentially become problematic. So for instance, you might have an invasive plant and then you have like a non-native insect that might feed on that plant and you bring it in and it finds out, it actually prefers this other native plant and then it ends up, becoming two problems.
Yeah.
So, yeah. We've got another invasive here. This is a small tree, obviously. It grows as a shrub to a small tree. Again, simple leaves, meaning that it's just not broken up into multiple little leaflets. So it's these simple oval-shaped leaves that can be actually sort of opposite and alternate along the stem. You kind of see a little bit of both along the stem. So it's kind of an interesting branching pattern with these simple leaves that grows to the size of a small tree and also gets these little dark round berries on them that will eventually turn red as they ripen. Or no, excuse me, I believe they start red and then they turn black as they ripen. They're also very favored by birds. So that's another issue with this plant. And this is what is called glossy buckthorn.
Oh yeah.
Glossy buckthorn. So named because a lot of the species that are in the same genus as this are actually thorned plants. The glossy buckthorn does not have any thorns, but it shares that genus, so that's how we get the name. And I believe this was introduced as another hedgerow plant, another rapidly growing ornamental plant that can be brought in to fill in an area really quickly. But again, has broken out of our yards and has spread to a lot of forested areas. Deer tend not to eat them, so that's another aspect where deer might preferentially browse native species, other herbivores browse more native species, and then kind of leave this to outcompete and outgrow. You'll see a lot of this growing on the floodplain down by the river. They kind of spread along riverways and things like that. But yeah, this is glossy buckthorn.
What's this little white plant here?
Oh, ghost kites.
Yes.
I've been dying to see those, and here they are.
So this is a good native plant.
Yeah.
Doesn't really look like,
Yeah, I do.
doesn't look much like a plant. A lot of people confuse this for like a mushroom or some type of fungus, but this is a ghost pipe, or ghost pipe is the most common name for it, but it is actually a parasitic plant.
Oh.
So you'll notice it doesn't have any green in it, and it doesn't really have any leaves. It's just the flower with these kind of non-photosynthetic little scales up the side. But it's not green because it doesn't need to photosynthesize and produce any of its own sugars like a lot of other plants do. Instead, it actually taps into a symbiotic fungus underneath the ground that further connects to a lot of the trees in the area, especially oaks. So basically you've got the oaks up in the canopy, photosynthesizing, taking the sunlight, making sugar out of it, and that gets sent down the trunk to the roots, to all the other parts of the tree and the plant. Trees will trade nutrients and sugars with the symbiotic fungi that live underground, so that's how the fungus gets the sugar. And then other parasitic plants like ghost pipe can then tap into that fungus and get the sugar. So this is being fed by, the leaves up in the canopy.
Are there other parasitic plants that do have chlorophyll, or is this more?
Yes, there are. So there's plants called broom rape that is photosynthetic, but does the same sort of thing where it taps into the roots and the fungi of other plants. There are other non-photosynthesizing plants very similar to this called like pine sap. There's another one called cancer root. But they're all, those last three that I mentioned, the ghost pipe, cancer root, and the pine sap, those are all non-photosynthesizing. So very similarly, they only really produce like the flowers in the above ground structure. They don't have any true leaves because they've lost the need for them.
So all the plants that I've heard of were like photosynthesis, and like fungus was more so very similar in attribute to that. So like, what makes it a plant rather than a fungus?
So it's a plant because it's that's a good question, by the way. It's a plant because, as we can see, it produces these little flowers. So we know it's a flowering plant. It's one of the angiosperms, which are our flowering plants. And it is descended from other photosynthesizing species that used to, before it evolved to tap into the fungus, it used to produce its own sugars. And different aspects of the biology of it make it a plant, like its cell walls are made of cellulose, made from cellulose, as opposed to chitin, which is what the cell walls of fungi are made of. So there's a number of different things, but when you take a hard look at it, you see that it is in fact a plant that's got a very interesting evolutionary history. Yeah. Ghost pipe. We will be talking a little bit more about plants like that in the mushroom and tree walk, which we have on Saturday. So I know some of you are going to be on that, but if you haven't heard, we will be having a mushroom and tree walk at Barrett Park on Saturday morning. So we'll talk a little bit more about symbiotic fungi and things like that. And this is poison ivy for anyone that's not
I was
familiar.
just gonna ask you. And Virginia
Getting all
creeper.
in there. Yeah.
Yeah.
But if you don't know poison ivy, it's important to know, especially there's a ton of it down in here. So leaves of 3, and it's got these.
That is a native plant, though.
It is a native vine, yes, and it's got these kind of serrations along the teeth.
Question for you, Nick. I've
Yes.
been working in my yard and I've seen poison ivy. I've also seen what I think is wild blackberry. Will poison ivy ever have a barb on its stem?
No.
Okay.
So the blackberry, they can kind of look a little bit like
Yeah,
poison ivy,
right.
depending on the leaflets.
Is that Virginia creeper?
That is, yes.
Okay. Yeah.
So sort of similar, has serrations along the edge, but they're a little tighter than on the poison ivy. Poison ivy doesn't always have that. Sometimes they're smooth all the way around.
So this poison ivy, that's Virginia creeper?
Yes.
Leaves of 5, let them thrive.
Let them thrive.
That's a good
Okay.
way. Yeah, that's a good
Right.
rhyme.
And then does poison ivy always have that mitten-looking leaf or not?
Not always.
Okay.
Yeah, sometimes all the leaflets are smooth. Sometimes the outer ones have the teeth. And
Okay.
sometimes they're very heavily toothed like that. Like this one's got a lot.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And they're
Yeah.
native.
So this is a little. I think this is a dewberry, which is a type of bramble. It's related to blackberries and raspberries.
I wonder if that's what
So
I've
do-
been seeing. Oh,
Poison ivy only grow in
That might be
groups
what I
of
have
three?
in my yard is blueberry.
Or groups of three, I guess.
Yeah, they'll always have the 3 leaflets. Like this is 1 leaf, botanically speaking. This is 1 leaf with 3 leaflets, so they will always grow like that, unless a leaf has been plucked off. Right.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of different pictures of them, so it's good to see them. Yeah.
Well, here we've got another invasive. I know someone had mentioned it earlier. Does anyone recognize this?
Well, that's not the one that
Knotweed.
takes. Oh, okay.
Is it the Japanese knotweed?
Yep.
It is?
Japanese knotweed, exactly.
Right.
So,
What's so pretty about it?
what's so pretty about it?
Yeah, like why?
Well, it's not super flashy, but these got these little delicate white flowers that are just starting to form on this one. They have these tiny little 3-part flowers, and the stem is also kind of unique. It's got this sort of bamboo-y looking, heavily notched stem up here, and it's a very fast grower. It is very fast. It is technically an herb. It's a woody herb. So like this is all new growth from this year, and they'll die back to the ground every year and then resprout, but they can grow 10-15 feet if in a really good condition and within a growing season. But it is very aggressive invasive. It is one of if not the worst invasive globally, depending on who you ask, I guess, because it is just spread so readily wherever it's introduced. Japanese knotweed is a very aggressive resprouter, so some people make the mistake of mowing down a big patch of it if they have it on their property to try and cut it down and clear it out, but that just triggers the plant to resprout and grow again.
That's one of those plants that is the only way to deal with it is herbicide.
Yes, so you have to do paint on or spray on herbicide. Best way to do it is cut back the stem at the ground and paint on. Can't remember the name, but there's a particular herbicide that they use.
Glyphosate, maybe?
Maybe something like that, but
Grow from a mat of rhizome.
yes. So exactly. So it spreads by a rhizome, which is a specialized underground stem that grows along the roots. So it can spread through an area like that, or when you mow it, if you get like a little chunk, even that's like an inch long, it's possible for that to reroot itself and eventually lead to another whole other plant. So when you mow it and cut it up like that, you're just kind of spreading it around.
Blackberries and
And it will often grow along riverways and streams because, as floods come down and maybe wash out some of the plants, because of that resprouting, if a chunk breaks off and flows down the river and lands on the bank, it can reestablish and grow a whole other patch. And we won't be getting much closer to the river, but the Nashua is right behind us here. And if you take a peek through the woods, or if you're ever walking along the Nashua, you'll just see this all over the place. It's everywhere. And it grows very, very dense. Like this is kind of an unusual way to find it with just one individual. We'll see further up kind of a more typical pattern where it just forms a complete monoculture and shades out everything else so that no other plants can even like germinate. There's very little light getting down past these in the summertime.
So when you say it's an herb, is that a way of growing, or is that like a genetic preference?
Yes. So there's I guess they're all sort of human constructs, right? So, but herbs are basically like non-woody plants. So there's herbs, there's vines, which are woody plants that twine up and grow up other plants. There's shrubs, which are woody plants that are smaller than trees, and then there's trees, which are woody plants that grow at least a few inches thick at the base and then can grow up tall like that. But herbs are basically just like non-woody plants. So because this dies back to the ground every year and resprouts, and it doesn't have, I think there is lignin in the tissues here, which is the chemical fat that makes up a large portion of wood. But technically it is an herb. And other species in this family, it's in the buckwheat family, so it's related to buckwheat. But obviously, you know, buckwheat is an herbaceous plant, doesn't produce any wood. So it's just like a giant herb, basically. Yeah. Yeah. Introduced as an ornamental. Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah. All right.
See, it kind of like not like that's ironweed.
Oh yeah, I have seen that actually. Very pretty.
That's pretty.
Or that's a native. Actually,
Yeah.
it's a native that people use to crowd out invasive species.
Oh, that's good. It's working kind of the other way it normally does.
It's so aggressive.
Yeah.
So are there any invasive species that are in Europe or Japan or Asia that come from here?
100%, absolutely. So, an easy one to point out is it's a mammal that we're all familiar with, the raccoon. So I think it was back in the 80s, there was some cartoon that was very popular in Japan that starred a raccoon, and there was a trend that started from that where people would like buy raccoons and keep them as pets, but they're, you know, wild animals, so they get aggressive at some point, people release them, or they just kind of escaped eventually, and now raccoons are a really bad invasive species on a lot of islands in Japan. And same thing in Germany. I think there was like one guy that took it upon himself to introduce raccoons to Germany for some kind of harebrained reason, and they're actively spreading through Germany right now. But there's tons of, you know, in the same way that plants from Asia come over here and it's a new environment, it's the same thing here. Like the plants that are native to this area are not existing in Asia. So when they get over there, it has the same effect where there's no natural predators or no kind of diseases that keep them in check, and they kind of spread out of control. Got another one here. A very common invasive. Is anyone familiar with this? It's got thorns on it.
Not a rose relative, is it?
It is a rose.
Really?
So this is multiflora rose,
Oh yeah.
and this is a very aggressive invasive across the U.S. It's covered in these recurved thorns that are pretty nasty, and it has compound leaves as opposed to a lot of the other plants that we talked about. So compound leaves just mean it's made up of many separate leaflets, usually like 7 to 9, as you can see here. And it produces these
Thickets.
little, yes, thickets. It grows real thick, but it produces these little white flowers that are roses. So they look like kind of miniature little roses, 5 petals. And I believe, yes, multiflora rose is actually one of those plants that was intentionally introduced by various government programs for road stabilization. Because, yes, because they grow very aggressively, like a lot of invasive plants, or a lot of plants that have become invasive, you know, tend to do. They spread like that because they grow so aggressively. So this was selected as a roadside stabilization plant for that purpose because they grow so quickly and help stabilize the soil. But yes, so yeah, kudzu is a very aggressive invasive vine that's ravaging the southeast. That was also introduced intentionally as a roadside stabilizer. But yeah, just a very common invasive, nasty thorns on it, and crowds out. There's not many native rose species, but like other invasives, you know, crowds out native environments. Yeah. This is a bittersweet vine, so just wanted to point that out so you can become familiar with the bark, because it is a woody plant. It does develop a pretty thick bark after a while.
Jewelweed.
Yes. Yes. So this is a nice native plant.
Pretty.
This is jewelweed, or also called touch-me-not, because it's got these little seed pods on it. Maybe you can catch this on the camera. You got it? So when you touch it, it pops open and will shoot the seeds out.
Favorite for children's garden.
Yeah, so it's pretty fun, you know. You got to find the mature seed pods on here, but animals walking by will bump it, and then it makes the seeds shoot out. That one's not mature enough. Yeah,
They're very pretty.
yeah, jewelweed, very pretty native. Bumblebees like it. So,
Back to the trees now.
oh yeah,
You can sort of see that.
yeah, the big clearing. So this is another one of our invasives here. It's a shrub, sometimes growing to a small tree. It has these arching branches that grow really thick, alternate simple leaves, and the leaves are very bright and light colored underneath. And it grows these little drupes, these little kind of berry-like fruits on it that are speckled and are red when mature. I don't see any on here, but I will point them out if I see on another plant. But this is what is known as autumn olive. So it is related to, you know, our domestic olives that we eat. But this was introduced from Eurasia. Another intentional introduction, because it is actually a nitrogen fixing plant. So for various reasons, most of the atmosphere that we breathe is actually made up of nitrogen that is inert to us. Like, we don't use it for anything. We just breathe it in, breathe it out. We're looking for the oxygen, right? But 70% of the atmosphere is actually made of nitrogen, which is unavailable to many plants, and it's very hard to take out of the air and make it available as part of different nutrients. So certain plants, a lot of plants in the bean family and the pea family are nitrogen fixers. So they have specialized bacteria that live in their roots that fix the nitrogen or pull it from the atmosphere and make it available for the plant. Yes, beans, a lot of legumes, another tree that we'll go over eventually here. But autumn olive is one of the rare plants that's not in the bean family, but is also a nitrogen fixer. So that's an example of convergent evolution, where two species or groups of species might not be descended from one another, but they evolve the same abilities independent of one another. So this also evolved a way to nitrogen fix, and that was part of its reintroduction, or its introduction to North America, was because it is a known nitrogen fixer. So it was intentionally planted in poor soils or degraded soils to try and up the nitrogen content and restore different sites. Sort of a short-sighted mission, because as we see now, it's an invasive and does grow very rapidly on like roadsides and poor nutrient poor sites as well, like up here and up closer to the family center. You'll see big thickets of this.
Weren't you saying that they do that deliberately, like to get it on roads to fix them?
Yeah, so this was introduced intentionally, maybe as a roadside stabilizer, but more specifically, I was reading for to like rehabilitate like depleted soils and things like that, like agricultural fields that might have been farmed too aggressively and need more nitrogen in the soil. It does produce berries, little tiny olives. You can eat them. They are edible, I know. I think I have not had them. Maybe I'll try one up here, but they are a little tart from what I've read. Autumn olive. Autumn olive. So it is related to our domestic olive trees, which are also native to Europe and Asia. So you might be able to see that seed pop open. They really jump. Yeah. Well, they don't want to pop. There we go. That was a good one.
I got that one.
Yeah.
This is good.
So they grow, they have this little like kind of spring that grows in there that ends up popping things open. Okay. So we got another invasive here. Very similar to our native sumacs, but this is not a sumac. Does anyone know what this is? This is a tree of heaven, right. So they produce these very large leaves. This is one leaf with many leaflets. And some ways to distinguish it from some of the native sumacs is they form these little, what are called nectaries, which are these little glands near the base of the leaf. You can kind of see these little like teeth, sort of outgrowths at the bottom of these leaflets, so that is not produced in sumacs. And they grow very quickly. When they get older, they form almost like a cantaloupe type bark. So you can see on this mature tree right here, this is a tree of heaven right in front of us. And if you can see the bark, it's got a very similar texture to like a cantaloupe rind. But they produce these very large compound leaves, which have a very lovely odor. If you smell them, it smells a bit like, what does that smell like?
I don't know. It's
You can take that and pass it down.
very, very strong.
Yeah. Smells a bit, I've heard it described like a rotten peanut butter type of smell.
I can see it.
Yeah. So. Yeah, I don't particularly like it. That might be my connotation with it, yeah. But yeah, so it's definitely that peanut buttery sort of odor is very distinct. Like you'll recognize this now if you smell it ever again. That's tree of heaven. It's very similar to like our native sumacs, like I said. So if you look over here
Is it related?
with the similar compound leaves, that is actually a native staghorn sumac.
Is it related?
No, they are not related. They're just superficially look similar, but
Convergent evolution.
yes, exactly. So there's a leaf right here I can pluck and show you close up. So superficially kind of similar, but when you look at them next to each other, tree of heaven tends to have much larger leaves with smooth edges on the leaflets, where staghorn sumac has these teeth along the edges. And then if you look at the stem of the leaf and even along the branches and things, where you can see tree of heaven is smooth, whereas the staghorn sumac is covered in these very fine little hairs. And the seeds are very different. As has been mentioned, staghorn sumac produces these clusters of these fuzzy red seeds.
Actually, edible.
Yeah, it almost looks like a big like cone, these fuzzy red cones.
Yeah, you can make bush lemonade.
Yes, yeah, you can make things out of it. With tree of heaven, they just produce these little like winged seeds, sort of like maple seeds, but just these clusters of seed pods that will eventually fall from the tree.
I like reading I really am a fan of like.
So do you work for the city, or is it like a state thing? That's like,
Yes, so I work for, I'm the conservation agent, so I'm like the hired staff that represents the Conservation Commission, which is like a volunteer board that does all the permitting for like wetlands and things like that. And we manage a lot of the conservation lands across the city as well. All over the place over a lot of time. A lot of asking questions, yeah. We got one more here that is a very common one. I just think it's worth pointing out, but this is another tree. Does anyone recognize roughly, generally what kind of tree this might be? Yes, exactly. So it's got the classic kind of maple looking leaf with, it's a simple leaf, so it's all one piece with 3 to 5 lobes off of it, all coming to these little fine points here. Maples are opposite branching plants, so you can see here that the branches and the leaves are growing directly opposite one another on the stem. And you can see the bark over here starts off smooth gray bark and eventually develops these kind of shallow little furrows along the bark, developing these little furrows and ridges. But it can be pretty smooth to lightly rougher bark like that. And this is Norway maple, I should say. This is me not saying the name again. This is Norway maple, so obviously native to Europe, Northern Europe. An introduced tree because they grow relatively fast and they don't produce a lot of like junk, I guess you could say, that urban planners would call it, not like big heavy fruits or anything like that. Just like
So many like native maples that you have to go choose.
exactly right. So, and it's resistant to a lot of diseases that native maples might be subject to. So, another thing to point out, they have these rather large buds that can be helpful in distinguishing it from some of the other native maples. They get these round, large buds that turn red over the winter. I don't believe they do. So, yeah, I only ever see these like just as Norway maples. And they have relatively large leaves for maples as well, with a relatively long,
Different type, a little different.
yeah, relatively long stem here. So, yeah, Norway maple. All the maple trees in the common, like in the center of town, those are all Norways. Yeah, because those were all planted decades ago and people didn't really care. I think these are now classified as noxious weeds, so I don't think you can actually purchase them like from a landscaping company or anything like that. But they are very common. They're all over the place.
Like there's red maples and other decorative maples.
Exactly, yeah. It's very similarly to the winged euonymus and Japanese barberry. Those are classified as noxious weeds in many states, so you're not allowed to sell them, really. Yeah. Oh, sorry about that. All right. And just as we're walking here, you can take a look off to the right.
That's where we were.
You can see, yeah, a lot of the orange flowers. That's that jewel weed that we've seen. And does anyone recognize those flowers with the light, tiny flowers?
The poppers.
Yeah, so that is more of the Japanese knotweed. So you can see from the jewel weed over here all the way across to that gravel pile over there. That is all knotweed. And you can see in that area that was moved down there, you can see straight into it how it just grows super thick and grows out everything that was moved like that before. And you can see it gets quite tall. So yeah, this is goldenrod. This is a native, but it's growing through basically a monoculture of all of this stuff. So, well, the goldenrod is the yellow.
And also there's pokeweed.
Yeah, and there's some pokeweed there. But you can see that it's got these teeny tiny little flowers that are just starting to bud. When they open up, they're just a light green to white color, but not very spectacular flowers, but they produce many little small flowers on the tops right here. And another plant with a very particular smell. You can pass that around and give it a sniff. That is not goldenrod. So this is something called mugwort. Mugwort. A lot of plants, especially European plants, will have wort in the name, W-O-R-T, and that comes from an old Norse word for plant or weed, basically. So mugwort, they think the etymology, the origin of the word, comes from wort, meaning plant, and mug being an old English or an old Norse word for like a marsh, because they kind of grow in sort of marshy environments. But it is an invasive. It was introduced as early as the 1600s by Europeans. There is a number of medicinal and traditional herbal uses, medicinal uses. It's used in Chinese medicine. It's used in, what is it?
Okinawa, I was just reading a thing
Yeah.
about Okinawans having mugwort as part of their program.
Yep, definitely. I think some people will eat it as a vegetable. But it's used in moxibustion, which is when they do acupuncture and they like light the ends of the thing on fire. This is one of those herbs that they'll put in there. But yeah, you can see another monoculture forming plant, like from here all the way down to there. That's all mugwort. This is pokeweed.
Oh, that's pokeweed, okay.
Yeah, so it's got these little white flowers that
Yeah.
grow into these green berries that eventually ripen to like a dark purple. Yeah, they're poisonous. Do not eat those. Birds eat them, yeah. But it's a very common plant that kids will accidentally poison themselves because they have these very big, attractive berries, and you know, that's a common thing. Our last plant here. I know we ran a little long here, so I apologize if people have places to be, but
What is it? It looks like pea pods.
yeah, so it is a locust. It is black locust. And very astute observation with these pea pod-like plants. This is in the legume family, or the bean family, or the pea family. Fabaceae is the family name. But like a lot of bean or plants in the bean family, it's got these compound leaves with many little leaflets, and they have very aromatic, nectar-filled flowers. The bees do like them, that eventually develop into these very large, thick seed pods. And they are also covered in these, to varying degrees, they're covered in these little thorns as well. Some plants are thornier than others, but you'll often find these like pairs of thorns coming out along the stem. It is an invasive plant. However, it's not from Asia or Europe. This is actually native to the southern US, and especially places in the Appalachians and the Ozarks are the native range for this tree. But it is a fast growing tree, good for hedgerows, things like that, soil stabilization. So because of that, it's been introduced across the US outside of its native range. An interesting aspect of these seed pods, some biologists consider them a evolutionary anachronism, So basically that means that it is something that evolved and had a purpose, that interacted with another species, and that other species has since gone extinct. So these are basically, they don't have a functional role in the ecosystem anymore. And they think that they developed these big seed pods in the thorny growth. There's another locust tree, honey locust, that's right. That's not particularly closely related to this, but it forms big thorns and large seed pods like this. And some scientists think that the locust trees evolved these large seed pods as feed for large megafauna that used to live across North America, like mastodons, mammoths, other large mammals that are no longer extinct. There's nothing in the ecosystem that feeds on. Oh yeah, I've seen that.
Oh, all right.
Actually, yeah. I forgot it was right there, but I was checking that out earlier. There's no one home. No, it's a wasp, a paper wasp. Yeah.
So it's not.
Yeah, there's no one in there. Yeah, they would have interrupted me. I think there is a way to process them and eat. There's like a kind of a jelly sort of substance that fills the pod in between the seeds that I remember reading you can do something with, but I'm not sure how worth it is to do that. But technically, yeah, there are some culinary uses for it. But yeah, it's a big nectar producer. A lot of little white dangly flowers before they turn into these seed pods that the bees absolutely swarm all over. But yeah, this is a black locust. Yeah. And you can see it's got this rough, very furrowed bark. You see the 3 trees on the right here. Some of those over there, closer to
Distant past.
right. So yeah, and with that is our last invasive species on our walk here. So I just want to thank everyone. I know some of us parked in other places, so I just want to thank everyone for coming and take a look at the website and the Conservation Commission Facebook page. I'll always be posting, new walks as they're coming up. And like I mentioned before, we have a walk on this Saturday at 9:30 at Barrett Park. And that will be a mushroom and tree ID walk. So we got a lot of people signed up for that, but that should be a good time.